Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about code coverage. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, would you say that code coverage is a useful metric for software engineering teams? Yes, I would. I would, but not for the reason that some of the naysayers usually have, which is like, oh yeah, it's a false sensation of quality. It doesn't tell you actually how well you're doing with testing. I've heard it all before. I've heard all these arguments, I promise you, and I have still a good argument for you. And I promise you, it's not something I just took out of thin air. I like to think well thought through. I've only ever met one software developer who fought me on this, and this dude was he was special. Hopefully you will see my point. He didn't, but I'll try again with you. So the point that I'm trying to make here is basically that code coverage is a useful metric, not because it helps you make quality happen within the code base, because the problem with code coverage is that all it tells you is, did this line get executed as part of a test? That's all it tells you. Nothing else. Now, that is not a metric that you use to determine if this was a good test, because in theory I could create a test that just ran the function, didn't really check anything, and then hey, I got my coverage, right, because it just ran. So the thing that you want to use this metric for is to create a reminder system or an incentive system for writing tests in the first place. That's why I think it's probably a more useful metric than most things. Truly useless metrics are the metrics for like how long a card stays, like the Scrum metrics and so forth. For the average software team, I argue that these are completely useless. You're basically just measuring burn-down rates and things like that. This is actually a very concrete metric that will help you in a very direct way because of this one magic thing. When you set a threshold based on code coverage in your code, and that runs in your pipeline, that means that if someone forgets to write tests for their gigantic nice super feature, that pipeline will fail. And that is the most valuable thing that can happen for your overall health, code health, like testing health. Some people will argue with me and saying like, yeah, but you should have a culture around testing. And I go, yeah, you should have all of these things. But the reality is that most companies have a problem with their testing strategy because most software developers need to be reminded that this is the way that you should do things, because you don't always think about all the cases. You don't always work in a test-driven fashion, and you can preach this as much as you want. It's still never going to be universally true. It's still not going to be like everybody does it per default. It's never going to happen, ever. And even if it did, this would still be a useful thing, because sometimes you forget that you had an if statement somewhere that your test didn't cover. It didn't catch the fact that there's a whole branch of logic and so forth and so forth. So I even go as far as to say that for people who do code coverage like metrics more advancedly, they look at the branches. Like I tweak, usually line coverage is important, absolutely, but the branching, that's even more important. Because in many cases, as I said, you think about 3 cases, but you don't actually see that there are 4 paths through your function or something like that. That is very common. That's why this is so powerful, because it actually is better at evaluating how you tested all your cases. It doesn't tell you how good you're tested, it just makes sure that you didn't forget something. And so when you put that threshold in place, that pipeline fails, and now you got an organic reminder from, it's like the types, it's literally like having a type check or a lint check or whatever. It just tells you that you have these rules, so you should be doing this thing, you should follow this process, which in this case includes testing. You forgot to write tests. There's no linter is going to tell you that, or no type checker or something like that. So This is just, that's the way I try to preach to people. Think of it at the like that exact thing. It's exactly the same thing. You can change the rules, you can lower the threshold if you figure out that, yeah, actually this thing here we don't need tests for it, or it's like something you shouldn't be doing. You know, you can always tweak those numbers, but if you have them in place, you immediately make sure that people are reminded to write those tests. And then when you start writing tests, this is the second thing you should do. Have a weekly sync. Like I do it once a week, and there are certainly automatic ways of doing this. I've never really looked into it because it doesn't take much time to bump the number. But usually once a week we have a scheduled responsibility in my teams where you go, whoever is on, like currently responsible for taking care of internal issues and so forth. We usually have a person for that. That is on rotation. So whoever's turn it is to quote unquote be on call, update the number. It's a ping in the Slack channel. Just, hey, update the code coverage. All right, cool. You go in. It takes literally 5 seconds to update. Like you run the, well, plus the time it takes to run the test. You run the test. You get the new number, and see what it is. Bump it to that. Like you can floor it or do whatever you want, right? Like you just get the number up to the next level, and then continue doing that. Because what that basically does is that it continuously raises the threshold for you, so you don't have that scenario where you get a reminder because you went over the minimum, and then someone adds a lot of tests, builds it up, and somebody else forgets and pulls the whole number down again in a different area of the code. So if you do this on a schedule, you bump it every so often, you're always guaranteed to, at the very least, never go down in coverage. You're actually adding more and more tests, and then you have your linter reminder system in place for writing the test, and then you have to focus a lot more on, as I said, the quality part, which is just have a culture around it. But this is a more advanced, I would say that this is a more robust way of doing it. It has so far never failed me. It has done, I've only had success with this setup for every team I've ever worked with. I can tell you that especially in front end, this is like a godsend to do this, because I've so far never in my career been in a single front end project where the code coverage was above 50% when I started. But I've never left one where the number hasn't grown after doing this exact thing. So what I want you to take away from this is that, well, I believe that code coverage is a very useful metric for software teams. I don't think that it's not something you should use as a substitute for having a good testing culture and knowing how to write quality tests. But I do think that you should use it, as I said. Think of it as a linter or a type checker or something like that, or a unit test, whatever. You have decided on a process where you're supposed to write tests, and this thing is just here to automatically evaluate the code and make sure that you covered all your branches and so forth. You made sure that you wrote tests, etc., etc. The goal is not to, and I've coached other software developers with this as well, like they get so obsessed with the coverage number, so they try to like add arbitrary bullshit tests just to get up the number. Now you're doing it wrong. You can lower this number, that's fine. The point is that if you have written your tests correctly, you've covered all your code that you just committed, that new code that's going in, it has its tests, then the number should be going up. And then you continuously bump it, and sometimes you have to lower it because of reasons, but you shouldn't be able to forget to write tests for new code. That is the intention of doing this, and this is why it makes a really big difference if you do this versus not, because I can basically guarantee you that every single time you invest in this, you will see a difference in the overall tests that are being written. I can basically promise you that. Have a great day.